Okay, so what constitutes background information and that kind of overview that you often hear referred to when somebody says write an introduction? You've got to start with the broad background, the broad context. So within this short video we're going to think about that and show an example about the way in which this is constructed. Now if you're unsure about that kind of general flow of the introduction, go back to, there's a previous video which is about just the introduction in terms of the structure being a funnel. Go and watch that and then perhaps come back to this video. So let's think a little bit about kind of what constitutes background information. Well, what you have to think about is that you're trying to set the reader up. You're trying to provide the reader with enough information to be able to understand why the study that they're reading has been conducted. So in order to do that, you've got to provide them with enough information or evidence to give them context for what they are reading. So we've got to provide things like key issues. It might be that there is a key issue or a concept. We've probably got to clear up terminology, and that's a pretty important one within science, and also if there are particular definitions. An example might be that you're writing a study which is on, for example, HIIT exercise and HIIT-based training. We would need to define what we mean by HIIT. So that would be in the introduction. Because if we haven't defined it, there is no context for the work which follows. So you have to think about definitions going in here. And it doesn't mean we define everything, it's only those key components that appear in our title and will obviously appear, for example, when we get to our hypotheses and our purpose. We've got to think about particular terminology. Particularly in science, there are key bits of language that we may use that, again, we need to introduce the reader to. Now, we don't necessarily need to always define these, but we need to give that terminology context. So, for example, it might be that we are doing a study which is on VO2 max. So we would need to establish what we mean by VO2 max, not only defining it, but setting out the appropriate terminology. So VO2 max being maximal oxygen uptake or aerobic power. Without those, the reader has no rationale for what we want them to cover. So bear those in mind as you're kind of putting your background content together. We have to set this in context, so we're going to use information from recent studies or relevant studies. So in other words, we're going to use appropriate references. And if you want to know more about referencing, go to the video on how to use references in scientific research. Again, remember about being concise, and again, you'll see this in the example, because one of the things you've got to also remember is who's the audience that's reading this. So there's a big difference between writing for what we call a lay audience, that is people who are not from a science background, and writing for a scientific audience. Now, in all the work that you are going to be doing when you write lab reports or research projects or papers, you're writing for a scientific audience. So, in other words, you can assume knowledge. That's a really important point. That means you don't have to define everything that goes in there. So, here we just got a quick example that what we want to do, if you have a really good background, it allows to set everything in context. So here's a great example. So no studies to date have examined whether high intensity interval training reduces the incidence of exercise-induced asthma. So that would almost come at the end of our background study. So in other words, it leads us into the next part, which is kind of the rationale for why we want to get into what we want to look at. Okay, so here we can see an example. So we've got a general introduction, and straight away, if you read the first few sentences, you'll see how broad the context is. So remember, let's just again set this in context if you've not watched the other videos. So the title of this whole research study is what is the minimum number of trials needed to produce reliable grip strength results in males and females for two different grip strength manoeuvres. So let's see how the introduction starts broad. Remember, we're setting that background context. The assessment of strength is fundamental in the monitoring of athletes and clinical populations. So in other words, we've not gone into grip straight away, we've gone into strength. Remember that grip dynamometry is a subset of strength. It's a test used to assess strength. So strength is the broader context, grip is the narrowing down. And that has been set in the context of references. With grip dynamometry, now we've narrowed it down a little bit more. So we've come from that very broad opening sentence, with grip dynamometry considered a valid and reliable surrogate of whole body strength. But we're still very broad. And again, that's been set in the context of a reference. Recent works in the general population show significant positive correlation, and the data has been provided, R equals 0.891, between grip strength and the 1 repetition max. And again, that's referenced. But notice now, and this will appear in the next video, notice now the next sentence, how the tone changes slightly. However, little is known about how many trials are needed to familiarise participants. So in other words, we've moved from these broad contexts, we're setting our paper, our work in a wider world. Think about the funnel example. So we've started out broad in terms of what strength is, and we haven't necessarily had to define it, but we've set a context for it. Remember, we don't have to define. We're only defining if it's fundamental to the question we're asking, but context is important. We've narrowed that down a little bit into grip dynamometry, and we've even shown why grip dynamometry is considered a useful tool because of its association with whole body strength. So we're broad, but we haven't yet got down to the kind of the rationale. We've got into this kind of idea about why it's used, but we haven't narrowed it down. So that gives you a clear example about how you set background in an introduction. It's referenced, it's setting context, but it's not so broad that it's impossible to kind of get an idea of where the study is going to go. So when you're putting your introductions together, think about that notion of, are you telling a logical story? What you don't want to do is be disjointed. So for example, if this had started with, works in the general population show a significant positive correlation between grip strength and 1 repetition max. Okay, that's all right, but where's the context for that? You've come in too narrow straight away. So in the context of this question, and that's the important thing, you've always got to set this in the context of the question that you're asking. This goes from that broad to slightly narrow. We've not come very narrow, so you don't want to come very broad and then very narrow. You want to funnel it in. And so think about that as you're building your introductions.